The 2020 United States presidential election was the 59th quadrennial presidential election, held on Tuesday, November 3, 2020. The Democratic ticket of former Vice President Joe Biden and the junior U.S. Senator from California Kamala Harris defeated the incumbent Republican President Donald Trump and incumbent Vice President Mike Pence. The election took place against the backdrop of the global COVID-19 pandemic and related recession. It was the first election since 1992 in which the incumbent president failed to win a second term. The election saw the highest voter turnout by percentage since 1900, with each of the two main tickets receiving more than 74 million votes, surpassing Barack Obama's record of 69.5 million votes from 2008. Biden received more than 81 million votes, the most votes ever cast for a candidate in a U.S. presidential election. In a competitive primary that featured the most candidates for any political party in the modern era of American politics, Biden secured the Democratic presidential nomination over his closest rival, Senator Bernie Sanders. Biden's running mate, Harris, became the first African American, first Asian American, and third female vice presidential nominee on a major party ticket. Trump secured renomination against token opposition in the Republican primaries. Jo Jorgensen secured the Libertarian presidential nomination with Spike Cohen as her running mate, and Howie Hawkins secured the Green presidential nomination with Angela Nicole Walker as his running mate. The central issues of the election included the public health and economic impacts of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, civil unrest in reaction to the police murder of George Floyd and others, the Supreme Court following the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett, and the future of the Affordable Care Act. Due to the ongoing pandemic, a record number of ballots were cast early and by mail. Many more registered Democrats voted by mail than registered Republicans. As a result of a large number of mail-in ballots, some swing states saw delays in vote counting and reporting. This led to major news outlets delaying their projection of Biden and Harris as the president-elect and vice president-elect until the morning of November 7, 3.5 days after the election. Major media networks project a state for a candidate once there is high statistical confidence that the outstanding vote would be unlikely to prevent the projected winner from ultimately winning that state. Biden ultimately received the majority in the Electoral College with 306 electoral votes, while Trump received 232. Key to Biden's victory were his wins in the Democratic-leaning Great Lakes states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, which Trump carried in 2016 and whose combined 46 electoral votes were enough to swing the election to either candidate. Biden also became the first Democrat to win the presidential election in Georgia since 1992, in Arizona since 1996, and in Nebraska's 2nd congressional district since 2008. Before, during, and after Election Day, Trump and numerous other Republicans attempted to subvert the election and overturn the results, falsely alleging widespread voter fraud and trying to influence the vote-counting process in swing states. Attorney General William Barr and officials in each of the 50 states found no evidence of widespread fraud or irregularities in the election. Federal agencies overseeing election security said it was the most secure in American history. The Trump campaign and its allies, including Republican members of Congress, continued to engage in numerous attempts to overturn the results of the election by filing 63 lawsuits in several states, spreading conspiracy theories alleging fraud, pressuring Republican state election officials and legislators to change results, pressuring the Department of Justice to declare the election corrupt and intervene, objecting to the Electoral College certification in Congress, and refusing to cooperate with the presidential transition of Joe Biden. This culminated in a mob of Trump supporters attacking the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021, after Trump repeatedly said that he would never concede the election. On January 7, however, Trump acknowledged the incoming administration without mentioning Biden's name. Biden and Harris were inaugurated on January 20, 2021. Background. Procedure. Article 2 of the United States Constitution states that for a person to serve as president, the individual must be a natural-born citizen of the United States, be at least 35 years old, and have been a United States resident for at least 14 years. Candidates for the presidency typically seek the nomination of one of the various political parties in the United States. Each party develops a method to choose the candidate the party deems best suited to run for the position. Primary elections are usually indirect elections where voters cast ballots for a slate of party delegates pledged to a particular candidate. The party's delegates then officially nominate a candidate to run on the party's behalf. The presidential nominee typically chooses a vice presidential running mate to form that party's ticket, which is then ratified by the delegates at the party's convention. The general election in November is also an indirect election, in which voters cast ballots for a slate of members of the Electoral College. These electors then directly elect the president and vice president. If no candidate receives the minimum 270 electoral votes needed to win the election, the United States House of Representatives will select the president from among the 3 candidates who received the most electoral votes, and the United States Senate will select the vice president from among the candidates who received the 2 highest totals. The presidential election occurred simultaneously alongside elections for the House of Representatives, the Senate, and various state and local level elections. The Maine legislature passed a bill in August 2019 adopting ranked choice voting both for presidential primaries and for the general election. Governor Janet Mills allowed the bill to become law without her signature, which delayed its taking effect until after the 2020 Democratic primary in March and made Maine the first state to use RCV for a presidential general election. The Maine Republican Party filed signatures for a veto referendum to preclude the use of RCV for the 2020 election, but Secretary of State Matthew Dunlap found there were insufficient valid signatures to qualify for the ballot. A challenge in Maine Superior Court was successful for the Maine Republican Party, but the Maine Supreme Judicial Court stayed the ruling pending appeal on September 8, 2020. Nevertheless, ballots began being printed later that day without the veto referendum and including RCV for the presidential election, and the court ruled in favor of the Secretary of State on September 22, allowing RCV to be used. An emergency appeal to the Supreme Court was denied on October 6. The law continues the use of the congressional district method for the allocation of Maine's electors. While multiple rounds of vote counting were not needed due to a single candidate receiving a majority of first-choice votes statewide and in each district, use of RCV complicates interpretation of the national popular vote because voters are more likely to vote for third-party or independent candidates. On December 14, 2020, pledged electors for each candidate, known collectively as the United States Electoral College, gathered in their states' capitals to cast their official votes. Pursuant to the processes laid out by the Electoral Count Act of 1887, certificates of ascertainment listing the names of the electors and separate certificates recording their votes are distributed to various officials across the branches of government. The newly elected Congress, with the Vice President in his role as Senate President presiding, met in a joint session to formally open the certificates and count the votes, which began on January 6, 2021, was interrupted by the January 6 United States Capitol attack, and finished the following day. Simultaneous elections. The presidential election occurred simultaneously with elections to the Senate and the House of Representatives. Gubernatorial and legislative elections were also held in several states. For the subsequent election, the United States House will redistribute the seats among the 50 states based on the results of the 2020 United States Census, and the states will conduct a redistricting of congressional and state legislative districts. In most states, the governor and the state legislature conduct the redistricting, although some states have redistricting commissions. Often, a party that wins a presidential election experiences a coattail effect that also helps other candidates of that party win elections. Therefore, the party that wins the 2020 presidential election could also win a significant advantage in drawing new congressional and state legislative districts, which would stay in effect until 2032. Nominations. Democratic Party. Joe Biden became the presumptive nominee of the Democratic Party on June 5, 2020, when he secured enough delegates to ensure his nomination at the National Convention. He was formally nominated at the convention on August 18. Republican Party. Every incumbent president seeking another term, with the partial exception of Lyndon Johnson in 1968, has been renominated by their party since 1884. Donald Trump and his running mate, Mike Pence, were able to easily secure the nomination after receiving enough delegates in the 2020 Republican presidential primaries. Libertarian Party. Jo Jorgensen, who was the running mate of author Harry Browne in 1996, received the Libertarian nomination at the National Convention on May 23, 2020. She achieved ballot access in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. Green Party. Howie Hawkins became the presumptive nominee of the Green Party on June 21, 2020, and was officially nominated by the party on July 11, 2020. Hawkins secured ballot access in 29 states and the District of Columbia, representing 381 electoral votes, and write-in access in 16 more states, representing 130 electoral votes. General election campaigns. Ballot access. Party conventions. The 2020 Democratic National Convention was originally scheduled for July 13-16 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but was delayed to August 17-20 due to the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. On June 24, 2020, it was announced that the convention would be held in a mixed online in-person format, with most delegates attending remotely but a few still attending the physical convention site. On August 5, the in-person portion of the convention was scaled down even further. Major speeches, including Biden's, were switched to a virtual format. The 2020 Republican National Convention took place from August 24-27 in Charlotte, North Carolina, and various remote locations. Originally, a 3-day convention was planned to be held in North Carolina, but due to North Carolina's insistence that the convention follow COVID-19 social distancing rules, the speeches and celebrations were moved to Jacksonville, Florida. However, due to the worsening situation with regards to COVID-19 in Florida, the plans there were cancelled, and the convention was moved back to Charlotte in a scaled-down capacity. The 2020 Libertarian National Convention was originally scheduled to be held in Austin, Texas, over Memorial Day weekend from May 22 to 25, but all reservations at the JW Marriott downtown Austin for the convention were cancelled on April 26 due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Libertarian National Committee eventually decided the party would hold 2 conventions, one online from May 22-24 to select the presidential and vice presidential nominees and one at a physical convention in Orlando, Florida, from July 8-12 for other business. The 2020 Green National Convention was originally to be held in Detroit, Michigan, from July 9 to 12. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the convention was instead held online, without a change in date. Issues unique to the election. Impeachment. Effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. Foreign interference. Trump's potential rejection of election results. Election delay suggestion. Postal voting. Federal Election Commission issues. Supreme Court vacancy. Pre-election litigation. Debates. On October 11, 2019, the Commission on Presidential Debates announced that 3 general election debates would be held in the fall of 2020. The first, moderated by Chris Wallace, took place on September 29, and was co-hosted by Case Western Reserve University and the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio. The debate was originally to be hosted at the University of Notre Dame in Notre Dame, Indiana, but the university decided against holding the debate as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Biden was generally held to have won the first debate, with a significant minority of commentators calling it a draw. One exchange that was particularly noted was when Trump did not directly denounce the white supremacist and neo-fascist group Proud Boys, which explicitly engages in political violence, instead responding that they should stand back and stand by. On the next day, Trump told reporters the group should stand down while also claiming that he was not aware of what the group was. The debate was described as chaotic and nearly incoherent because of Trump's repeated interruptions, causing the CPD to consider adjustments to the format of the remaining debates. The vice presidential debate was held on October 7, 2020, at the University of Utah in Salt Lake City. The debate was widely held to be subdued, with no clear victor. One incident that was particularly commented on was when a fly landed on Vice President Pence's head, and remained there unbeknownst to him for 2 minutes. The second debate was initially set to be held at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan, but the university withdrew in June 2020, over concerns regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. The planned debate was rescheduled for October 15 at the Adrienne Arsht Center for the Performing Arts in Miami, but due to Trump contracting COVID-19, the CPD announced on October 8 that the debate would be held virtually, in which the candidates would appear from separate locations. However, Trump refused to participate in a virtual debate, and the commission subsequently announced that the debate had been cancelled. The third scheduled debate took place on October 22 at Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee, and was moderated by Kristen Welker. The changes to the debate rules resulted in it being generally considered more civil than the first debate. Welker's performance as moderator was praised, with her being regarded as having done a good job preventing the candidates from interrupting each other. Biden was generally held to have won the debate, though it was considered unlikely to alter the race to any considerable degree. The Free and Equal Elections Foundation held 2 debates with various third-party and independent candidates, one on October 8, 2020, in Denver, Colorado, and another on October 24, 2020, in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Polling. 2-way. 4-way. Swing states. Endorsements. Total cost estimate. Open Secrets estimated the total cost of the 2020 election nearly $14 billion, making it the most expensive election in history and twice as expensive as the previous presidential election cycle. Campaign issues. COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic was a major issue of the campaign, with Trump's responses being heavily criticized. The president spread mixed messages on the value of wearing face masks as protection, including criticizing Biden and reporters for wearing them, but has also encouraged their use at times. During the campaign, Trump held many events across the country, including in COVID-19 hotspots, where attendees did not wear masks and were not socially distancing. At the same time, he mocked those who wore face masks. Biden advocated for the expansion of federal funding, including funding under the Defense Production Act for testing, personal protective equipment, and research. Trump also invoked the Defense Production Act to control the distribution of masks and ventilators, but his response plan relied significantly on a vaccine being released by the end of 2020. At the second presidential debate, Trump claimed Biden had called him xenophobic for restricting entry from foreign nationals who had visited China, but Biden responded that he had not been referring to this decision. Economy. Trump claimed credit for the consistent economic expansion of his presidency's first 3 years, with the stock market at its longest growth period in history and unemployment at a 50-year low. Additionally, he has touted the 2020 third quarter rebound, in which GDP grew at an annualized rate of 33.1%, as evidence of the success of his economic policies. Biden responded to Trump's claims by repeating that the strong economy under Trump's presidency was inherited from the Obama administration, and that Trump has aggravated the economic impact of the pandemic, including the need for 42 million Americans to file for unemployment. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017, which lowered income taxes for many Americans and lowered the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, were a major component of Trump's economic policy. Biden and the Democrats generally describe these cuts as unfairly benefiting the upper class. Biden plans to raise taxes on corporations and those making over $400,000 per year, while keeping the reduced taxes on lower income brackets, and raise capital gains taxes to a maximum bracket of 39.6%. In response, Trump said Biden's plans would destroy retirement accounts and the stock market. Environment. Trump and Biden's views on environmental policy differ significantly. Trump has stated that climate change is a hoax, although he has also called it a serious subject. Trump condemned the Paris Agreement on greenhouse gas reduction and began the withdrawal process. Biden planned to rejoin it and announced a $2 trillion plan to combat climate change. However, Biden has not fully accepted the Green New Deal. Biden does not plan to ban fracking, but rather to outlaw new fracking on federal land. However, in a debate, Trump claimed Biden wanted to ban it altogether. Trump's other environmental policies have included the removal of methane emission standards, and an expansion of mining. Healthcare. Healthcare was a divisive issue in both the Democratic primary campaign and the general campaign. While Biden, as well as other candidates, promised protection of the Affordable Care Act, progressives within the Democratic Party advocated to replace the private insurance industry with Medicare for all. Biden's plan involves adding a public option to the American healthcare system, and the restoration of the individual mandate to buy healthcare, which was removed from the Affordable Care Act by the 2017 tax cut bill, as well as restoring funding for Planned Parenthood. Trump announced plans to repeal the Affordable Care Act, calling it too expensive, but has not said what would replace it. At the time of the election, the Trump administration and Republican officials from 18 states had a lawsuit before the Supreme Court, asking the court to repeal the Affordable Care Act. Racial unrest. As a result of the murder of George Floyd and other incidents of police brutality against African Americans, combined with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, a series of protests and a wider period of racial unrest erupted in mid-2020. This was followed by the Black Lives Matter movement, which protested police brutality against black people, and became a central point of the 2020 presidential campaign. Protests were as a rule peaceful, fewer than 4% involved property damage or violence. However, according to a September 2020 estimate, arson, vandalism, and looting caused about $12 billion in insured damage between May 26 and June 8, making this initial phase of the George Floyd protests the civil disorder event with the highest recorded damage in United States history. In response, Trump and the Republicans suggested sending in the military to counter the protests, which was criticized, especially by Democrats, as heavy-handed and potentially illegal. Trump referred to Black Lives Matter protesters confronting diners in a restaurant as thugs, and called the movement a symbol of hate. Particularly controversial was a photo Trump took in front of St. John's Church in Washington, D.C., before which military police had forcefully cleared peaceful protesters from the area. Biden condemned Trump for his actions against protesters. He described George Floyd's words "I can't breathe" as a wake-up call for our nation. He also promised he would create a police oversight commission in his first 100 days as president, and establish a uniform use of force standard, as well as other police reform measures. Predictions. Results. Statistics. More than 158 million votes were cast in the election. More than 100 million of them were cast before Election Day by early voting or mail ballot, due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The election saw the highest voter turnout as a percentage of eligible voters since 1900, with each of the two main tickets receiving more than 74 million votes, surpassing Barack Obama's record of 69.5 million votes from 2008. The Biden-Harris ticket received more than 81 million votes, the most votes ever in a U.S. presidential election. However, it was the 9th consecutive presidential election where the victorious major party nominee did not receive a popular vote majority by a double-digit margin over the losing major party nominee, continuing the longest sequence of such presidential elections in U.S. history, which began in 1988 and in 2016 eclipsed the previous longest sequence, that from 1876 through 1900. In 2020, 58% of U.S. voters lived in landslide counties, a decline from 61% in 2016. Trump became the first U.S. president since 1992 and the 11th incumbent in the country's history to lose a bid for a second term. Biden's 51.3% of the popular vote was the highest for a challenger to an incumbent president since 1932. Although Ronald Reagan in 1980 and Bill Clinton in 1992 defeated their incumbent opponents by wider popular vote margins, their shares of the vote were kept lower by substantial third-party voting. Biden is the sixth vice president to become president without succeeding to the office on the death or resignation of a previous president. Additionally, Trump's loss marked the third time an elected president lost the popular vote twice, the first being John Quincy Adams in the 1820s and Benjamin Harrison in the 1880s and 1890s. This was the first time since 1980, and the first for Republicans since 1892 that a party was voted out after a single four-year term. This was the second election in American history in which the incumbent president lost re-election despite winning a greater share of the popular vote than they did the previous election, after 1828. Biden won 25 states, the District of Columbia, and one congressional district in Nebraska, totaling 306 electoral votes. Trump won 25 states and one congressional district in Maine, totaling 232 electoral votes. This result was exactly the reverse of Trump's victory, 306 to 232, in 2016, making it the first time two consecutive elections featured the same electoral vote distribution between candidates. Biden became the first Democrat to win the presidential election in Georgia since 1992 and in Arizona since 1996, and the first candidate to win nationally without Florida since 1992 and Ohio since 1960, casting doubt on Ohio's continued status as a bellwether state. Biden carried 5 states won by Trump in 2016, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. He also became the first Democrat since 2008 to carry Nebraska's 2nd congressional district, winning 1 electoral vote from the state. Trump did not win any states won by Clinton in 2016. Biden's 3 gains in the Rust Belt, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin were widely characterized as a rebuilding of the Blue Wall, a term widely used in the press for the states consistently won by Democrats from 1992 to 2012, broken by Trump in 2016 when he flipped those 3 Rust Belt states. Nevertheless, amidst Trump's national and electoral defeat, his scoring decisive victories in Ohio, Iowa, and Florida for the second time, after their having backed Obama twice, has led many commentators to conclude they've shifted from perennial swing states to reliable red states. In light of the attempts to contest the election results, an important question is how many votes would have had to change in particular states in order to produce a different electoral college outcome. If Biden's 3 narrowest state victories, Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona, all of which he won by less than a percentage point, had gone to Trump, there would have been a tie of 269 electors for each candidate, causing a contingent election to be decided by the House of Representatives, where Trump had the advantage. This scenario would have required a popular vote shift of 0.63% or less in each of these three states, a total of about 43,000 votes, 0.03% of votes cast nationally. A similar situation occurred in 2016, when a shift of 0.77% or less in each of the three most closely contested states, or about 77,000 votes, would have resulted in the popular vote winner Hillary Clinton also winning in the Electoral College. Almost all counties previously considered reliable indicators of eventual success in presidential elections voted for Trump instead of Biden, meaning that they did not continue their streaks as bellwether counties. This was attributed to increasing political polarization throughout the country and to the urban-rural divide. While Trump still dominated rural America as a whole, there were rural areas that he lost. Biden won 50.5% of the rural counties that each had mostly non-white voters, particularly in the South and the West. Rural counties in the South won by Biden had greater economic distress than those won by Trump. In the Northeast, the opposite was true. In the West, Biden did especially well in rural counties that had high shares of workers employed in leisure and hospitality. Such counties likewise had large constituencies of immigration from other states. Every state won by Biden was won by more votes than those by which Hillary Clinton won the state. The combined vote margin of these states was equal to Biden's gain over Hillary Clinton. Election calls. Major news organizations project a state for a candidate when there is high mathematical confidence that the outstanding vote would be unlikely to prevent the projected winner from ultimately winning the state. Election projections are made by decision teams of political scientists and data scientists. On November 6, election calling organization Decision Desk HQ projected that Biden had won the election after forecasting that Biden had won Pennsylvania. According to Decision Desk HQ, Pennsylvania's 20 electoral votes gave Biden a total of 273 electoral votes, 3 over the threshold to make him president-elect. Decision Desk HQ's clients Vox and Business Insider also called the race at that time. On the morning of November 7 at approximately 11:30 a.m. EST, roughly 3.5 days after polls had closed, ABC News, NBC News, CBS News, the Associated Press, CNN, and Fox News all called the election for Biden, based on projections of votes in Pennsylvania showing him leading outside of the recount threshold. That evening, Biden and Harris gave victory speeches in Wilmington, Delaware. OSCE election monitoring. On the invitation of the U.S. State Department, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, which has been monitoring U.S. elections since 2002, sent 102 observers from 39 countries. The task force consisted of long-term observers from the ODIHR office deployed to 28 states from September on and covering 15 states on Election Day, and a group of European lawmakers acting as short-term observers, reporting from Maryland, Virginia, California, Nevada, Michigan, Missouri, Wisconsin, and D.C. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, it was scaled down to a limited election observation mission from the originally planned 100 long-term observers and 400 short-term observers. An interim report published by the OSCE shortly before the election noted that many ODIHR interlocutors expressed grave concerns about the risk of legitimacy of the elections being questioned due to the incumbent president's repeated allegations of a fraudulent election process, and postal vote in particular. On the day after the election, the task force published preliminary findings, with part of the summary stating: the November 3 general elections were competitive and well managed despite legal uncertainties and logistical challenges. In a highly polarized political environment, harsh campaign rhetoric fueled tensions. Measures intended to secure the elections during the pandemic triggered protracted litigation driven by partisan interests. The uncertainty caused by late legal challenges and evidence-deficient claims about election fraud created confusion and concern among election officials and voters. Voter registration and identification rules in some states are unduly restrictive for certain groups of citizens. The media, although sharply polarized, provided comprehensive coverage of the campaign and made efforts to provide accurate information on the organization of elections. Link said that on the election day itself, we couldn't see any violations at the polling places visited by the observers. The task force also found nothing untoward while observing the handling of mail-in ballots at post offices, with Gasek being quoted as saying, "We feel that allegations of systemic wrongdoing in these elections have no solid ground. The system has held up well." The OSCE's Election Monitoring Branch published a more comprehensive report in early 2021. Electoral results. Candidates are listed individually below if they received more than 0.1% of the popular vote. Popular vote totals are from the Federal Election Commission report. Results by state. 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, allow their electoral votes to be split between candidates by congressional districts. The winner of each congressional district gets 1 electoral vote for the district. The winner of the statewide vote gets 2 additional electoral votes. Close states. States where the margin of victory was under 1%. Georgia, 0.23%, 16 electoral votes. Arizona, 0.31%, 11 electoral votes. Wisconsin, 0.63%, 10 electoral votes. States where the margin of victory was between 1% and 5%. Pennsylvania, 1.16%, 20 electoral votes. North Carolina, 1.35%, 15 electoral votes. Nevada, 2.39%, 6 electoral votes. Michigan, 2.78%, 16 electoral votes. Florida, 3.36%, 29 electoral votes. States/districts where the margin of victory was between 5% and 10%. Texas, 5.58%, 38 electoral votes. Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District, 6.50%, 1 electoral vote. Minnesota, 7.11%, 10 electoral votes. New Hampshire, 7.35%, 4 electoral votes. Maine's 2nd Congressional District, 7.44%, 1 electoral vote. Ohio, 8.03%, 18 electoral votes. Iowa, 8.20%, 6 electoral votes. Maine, 9.07%, 2 electoral votes. Blue denotes states or congressional districts won by Democrat Joe Biden, red denotes those won by Republican Donald Trump. County statistics. Counties with highest percentage of Democratic vote. Kalawao County, Hawaii 95.8%. Washington, D.C. 92.15%. Prince George's County, Maryland 89.26%. Oglala Lakota County, South Dakota 88.41%. Petersburg, Virginia 87.75%. Counties with highest percentage of Republican vote. Roberts County, Texas 96.18%. Borden County, Texas 95.43%. King County, Texas 94.97%. Garfield County, Montana 93.97%. Glasscock County, Texas 93.57%. Maps. Voter demographics. Voter demographic data for 2020 were collected by Edison Research for the National Election Pool, a consortium of ABC News, CBS News, MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, and the Associated Press. The voter survey is based on exit polls completed by 15,590 voters in person as well as by phone. The Brookings Institution released a report entitled Exit Polls Show Both Familiar and New Voting Blocs Sealed Biden's Win on November 12, 2020. In it, author William H. Frey attributes Obama's 2008 win to young people, people of color, and the college-educated. Frey contends Trump won in 2016 thanks to older white without college degrees. Frey says the same coalitions largely held in 2008 and 2016, although in key battleground states Biden increased his vote among some of the 2016 Trump groups, particularly among white and older Americans. Trump won the white vote in 2016 by 20% but in 2020 by only 16%. The Democratic Party won black voters by 75%, the lowest margin since 1980. Democrats won the Latino vote by 32%, which is the smallest margin since 2004, and they won the Asian American vote by 27%, the lowest figure since 2008. Biden reduced the Republican margin of white men without college educations from 48% to 42%, and the Democrats made a slight improvement of 2% among white, college-educated women. People age 18 to 29 registered a rise in Democratic support between 2016 and 2020, with the Democratic margin of victory among that demographic increasing from 19% to 24%. Post-election analysis using verified voter data found the Associated Press's votecast was more accurate than the exit polls. Voting patterns by ethnicity: Hispanic and Latino voters, Black voters, Asian American and Pacific Island voters, Indian American voters, American Indian and Alaska Native voters. Polling accuracy: although polls generally predicted the Biden victory, the national polls overestimated him by 3 to 4 points, and some state polling was even further from the actual result and greater than 2016's error. The numbers represented the highest level of error since the 1980 presidential election. This polling overestimation also applied in several Senate races, where the Democrats underperformed by about 5 points relative to the polls, as well as the House elections, where Republicans gained seats instead of losing as polls predicted. Most pollsters underestimated support for Trump in several key battleground states, including Florida, Iowa, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Texas, and Wisconsin. A notable exception was Ann Seltzer, who accurately predicted Republican victories in Iowa for the presidential and Senate races. The discrepancy between poll predictions and the actual result persisted from the 2016 election despite pollsters' attempts to fix problems with polling in 2016, in which they underestimated the Republican vote in several states. The imprecise polls led to changes in campaigning and fundraising decisions for both Democrats and Republicans. According to the New York Times, polling misses have been attributed to, among other issues, reduced average response to polling, the relative difficulty to poll certain types of voters, and pandemic-related problems, such as a theory which suggests Democrats were less willing to vote in person on Election Day than Republicans for fear of contracting COVID-19. According to CNN, research presented to the American Association for Public Opinion Research indicated one of the primary problems was an inability by pollsters to include a certain segment of Trump supporters, either due to inaccessibility or lack of participation. New Statesman data journalist Ben Walker pointed to Hispanics as a historically difficult group to poll accurately, leading to pollsters underestimating the level of Trump support within the demographic group. Election analyst Nate Silver of 538 wrote that the polling error was completely normal by historical standards and disputes the narrative that polls were wrong. Aftermath. Election night. Election night, November 3, ended without a clear winner, as many state results were too close to call and millions of votes remained uncounted, including in the battleground states of Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. Results were delayed in these states due to local rules on counting mail-in ballots. In a victory declared after midnight, Trump won the swing state of Florida by over 3 percentage points, an increase from his 1.2 percentage point margin in 2016. Having seen significant gains in support among the Latino community in Miami-Dade County. Shortly after 12:30 a.m. EST, Biden made a short speech in which he urged his supporters to be patient while the votes are counted, and said he believed he was on track to win this election. Shortly before 2:30 a.m. EST, Trump made a speech to a roomful of supporters, falsely asserting that he had won the election and calling for a stop to all vote counting, saying that continued counting was a fraud on the American people and we will be going to the U.S. Supreme Court. The Biden campaign denounced these attempts, claiming the Trump campaign was engaging in a naked effort to take away the democratic rights of American citizens. Late counting. In Pennsylvania, where the counting of mail-in ballots began on election night, Trump declared victory on November 4 with a lead of 675,000 votes, despite more than 1 million ballots remaining uncounted. Trump also declared victory in North Carolina and Georgia, despite many ballots being uncounted. At 11:20 p.m. EST on election night, Fox News projected Biden would win Arizona, with the Associated Press making the same call at 2:50 a.m. EST on November 4. However, several other media outlets concluded the state was too close to call. By the evening of November 4, the Associated Press reported that Biden had secured 264 electoral votes by winning Michigan and Wisconsin, with Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, and Nevada remaining uncalled. Biden had a 1% lead in Nevada and maintained a 2.3% lead in Arizona by November 5. Needing only to win Nevada and Arizona or to win Pennsylvania to obtain the necessary 270 electoral votes. Some Trump supporters expressed concerns of possible fraud after seeing the president leading in some states on election night, only to see Biden take the lead in subsequent days. Election experts attributed this to several factors, including a red mirage of early results being counted in relatively thinly populated rural areas that favored Trump, which are quicker to count, followed later by results from more heavily populated urban areas that favored Biden, which take longer to count. In some states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, Republican-controlled legislatures prohibited mail-in ballots from being counted before Election Day, and once those ballots were counted they generally favored Biden, at least in part because Trump had for months raised concerns about mail-in ballots, encouraging his supporters instead to vote in person. By contrast, in states such as Florida, which allowed counting of mail-in ballots for weeks prior to Election Day, an early blue shift giving the appearance of a Biden lead was later overcome by in-person voting that favored Trump, resulting in the state being called for the president on election night. On November 5, a federal judge dismissed a lawsuit by the Trump campaign to stop vote counting in Pennsylvania. The Trump campaign had alleged that its observers were not given access to observe the vote, but its lawyers admitted during the hearing that its observers were already present in the vote counting room. Also that day, a state judge dismissed another lawsuit by the Trump campaign which alleged that in Georgia, late arriving ballots were counted. The judge ruled no evidence had been produced that the ballots were late. Meanwhile, a state judge in Michigan dismissed the Trump campaign's lawsuit requesting a pause in vote counting to allow access to observers, as the judge noted that vote counting had already finished in Michigan. That judge also noted the official complaint did not state why, when, where, or by whom an election observer was allegedly blocked from observing ballot counting in Michigan. On November 6, Biden assumed leads in Pennsylvania and Georgia as the states continued to count ballots, and absentee votes in those states heavily favored Biden. Due to the slim margin between Biden and Trump in the state, Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger announced on November 6 that a recount would be held in Georgia. At that point, Georgia had not seen any widespread irregularities in this election, according to the voting system manager of the state, Gabriel Sterling. Also, on November 6, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito issued an order requiring officials in Pennsylvania to segregate late-arriving ballots, amid a dispute as to whether the state's Supreme Court validly ordered a 3-day extension of the deadline for mail-in ballots to arrive. Several Republican attorneys general filed amicus briefs before the U.S. Supreme Court in subsequent days agreeing with the Pennsylvania Republican Party's view that only the state legislature could change the voting deadline. By November 7, several prominent Republicans had publicly denounced Trump's claims of electoral fraud, saying they were unsubstantiated, baseless, or without evidence, damaging to the election process, undermining democracy, and dangerous to political stability, while others supported his demand of transparency. According to CNN, people close to Donald Trump, such as his son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner and his wife Melania Trump, urged him to accept his defeat. While Donald Trump privately acknowledged the outcome of the presidential election, he nonetheless encouraged his legal team to continue pursuing legal challenges. Trump expected to win the election in Arizona, but when Fox News declared Biden the victor of the state, Trump became furious and claimed the result was due to fraud. Trump and his allies suffered approximately 50 legal losses in 4 weeks after starting their litigation. In view of these legal defeats, Trump began to employ a public pressure campaign on state and local Republican officials to manipulate the electoral system on his behalf. Election protests. Protests against Trump's challenges to the election results occurred in Minneapolis, Portland, New York, and other cities. Police in Minneapolis arrested more than 600 demonstrators for blocking traffic on an interstate highway. In Portland, the National Guard was called out after some protesters smashed windows and threw objects at police. At the same time, groups of Trump supporters gathered outside of election centers in Phoenix, Detroit, and Philadelphia, shouting objections to counts that showed Biden leading or gaining ground. In Arizona, where Biden's lead was shrinking as more results were reported, the pro-Trump protesters mostly demanded that all remaining votes be counted, while in Michigan and Pennsylvania, where Trump's lead shrank and disappeared altogether as more results were reported, they called for the count to be stopped. False claims of fraud. Trump and a variety of his surrogates and supporters made a series of observably false claims that the election was fraudulent. Claims that substantial fraud was committed have been repeatedly debunked. On November 9 and 10, the New York Times called the offices of top election officials in every state. All 45 of those who responded said there was no evidence of fraud. Some described the election as remarkably successful considering the coronavirus pandemic, the record turnout, and the unprecedented number of mailed ballots. On November 12, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency issued a statement calling the 2020 election the most secure in American history and noting here is no evidence that any voting system deleted or lost votes, changed votes, or was in any way compromised. Trump fired the director of CISA 5 days later. As ballots were still being counted 2 days after Election Day, Trump falsely asserted that there was tremendous corruption and fraud going on, adding, "If you count the legal votes, I easily win. If you count the illegal votes, they can try to steal the election from us." Trump has repeatedly claimed that the results of mail-in ballots showing significantly more support for Biden is suspicious. This is a common phenomenon known as the blue shift, since more Democrats than Republicans tend to vote by mail, and mail ballots are counted after Election Day in many states. Leading up to the 2020 election, the effect was predicted to be even greater than usual, as Trump's attacks on mail-in voting may have deterred Republicans from casting mail ballots. In early January 2021, Trump falsely and repeatedly claimed that he won every single state in the presidential election, a 50-state sweep, and a 535-3 electoral college victory. On January 2, during his phone call to Brad Raffensperger, the Georgia Secretary of State, Trump said, "As you know, every single state. We won every state, we won every state house in the country. But we won every single state house." 2 days later, on January 4, Trump appeared at a campaign rally in Dalton, Georgia, showing his support for Republican Senators David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler. During his speech at the rally, Trump again asserted that he won every single state, and we win every state, and they're going to have this guy be president. Many claims of purported voter fraud were discovered to be false or misleading. In Fulton County, Georgia, the number of votes affected was 342, with no breakdown of which candidates they were for. A viral video of a Pennsylvania poll worker filling out a ballot was found to be a case of a damaged ballot being replicated to ensure proper counting, while a video claimed to show a man taking ballots illegally to a Detroit counting center was found to be actually depicting a photographer transporting his equipment. Another video of a poll watcher being turned away in Philadelphia was found to be real, but the poll watcher had subsequently been allowed inside after a misunderstanding had been resolved. A tweet that went viral claimed 14,000 votes in Wayne County, Michigan, were cast by dead people, but the list of names included was found to be incorrect. The Trump campaign and Fox News commentator Tucker Carlson also claimed a James Blaylock had voted in Georgia despite having died in 2006, though his 94-year-old widow had registered and voted as Mrs. James E. Blaylock. In Erie, Pennsylvania, a postal worker who claimed the postmaster had instructed postal workers to backdate ballots mailed after Election Day later admitted he had fabricated the claim. Prior to his recantation, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham cited the claim in a letter to the Justice Department calling for an investigation, and the worker was praised as a patriot on a GoFundMe page created in his name that raised $136,000. Days after Biden had been declared the winner, White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany asserted without evidence that the Democratic Party was welcoming fraud and illegal voting. Republican former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich stated on Fox News, "I think that it is a corrupt, stolen election." Appearing at a press conference outside a Philadelphia landscaping business as Biden was being declared the winner, Trump's personal attorney Rudy Giuliani asserted without evidence that hundreds of thousands of ballots were questionable. Responding to Giuliani, a spokesperson for Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro said, "Many of the claims against the Commonwealth have already been dismissed, and repeating these false attacks is reckless. No active lawsuit even alleges, and no evidence presented so far has shown, widespread problems." 1 week after the election, Republican Philadelphia City Commissioner Al Schmidt said he had not seen any evidence of widespread fraud, stating, "I have seen the most fantastical things on social media, making completely ridiculous allegations that have no basis in fact at all and see them spread." He added that his office had examined a list of dead people who purportedly voted in Philadelphia but not a single one of them voted in Philadelphia after they died. Trump derided Schmidt, tweeting, "He refuses to look at a mountain of corruption and dishonesty. We win." Attorneys who brought accusations of voting fraud or irregularities before judges could not produce actual evidence to support the allegations. In one instance, a Trump attorney sought to have ballot counting halted in Detroit on the basis of a claim by a Republican poll watcher that she had been told by an unidentified person that ballots were being backdated. Michigan Court of Appeals Judge Cynthia Stevens dismissed the argument as inadmissible hearsay within hearsay. Some senior attorneys at law firms working on Trump's behalf, notably Jones Day, expressed concerns that they were helping to undermine the integrity of American elections by advancing arguments lacking evidence. Trump and his lawyers Giuliani and Sidney Powell repeatedly made the false claim that the Toronto, Ontario-based firm Dominion Voting Systems, which had supplied voting machines for 27 states, was a communist organization controlled by billionaire George Soros, former Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, or the Chinese Communist Party, and that the machines had stolen hundreds of thousands of votes from Trump. The false claims about the company circulated on social media, amplified by more than a dozen tweets or retweets by Trump. The disinformation campaign prompted threats and harassment against Dominion employees. A December 2020 poll showed 77% of Republicans believe widespread fraud occurred during the election. 35% of independent voters also said they believe widespread voter fraud took place. Overall, 60% of Americans believed Biden's win was legitimate, 34% did not, and 6% were unsure. Another poll taken in late December showed a similar result, with 62% of Americans polled believing Biden was the legitimate winner of the election, while 37% did not. This split in popular opinion remained largely stable, with the January 10, 2021, poll commissioned by ABC News showing 68% of Americans believed Biden's win was legitimate and 32% did not. These numbers remained largely stagnant, with the June 2021 poll from Monmouth showing 61% believed Biden won fair and square, 32% believed he won due to fraud, and 7% were unsure. More than a year later, public opinion on the matter still remained stagnant, with a poll commissioned by ABC News finding that 65% of Americans believed Biden's win was legitimate, 33% believed it was not legitimate, and 2% were unsure. The same poll also found that 72% of Americans thought the people involved in the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, were attacking democracy, while 25% thought they were protecting democracy, and 3% were unsure. A March 2022 poll commissioned by the conservative Rasmussen Reports found that 52% of voters think that it is likely that cheating affected the outcome of the 2020 presidential election, while 40% of voters believe that it is unlikely. 33% say that cheating was very likely, 19% say it was somewhat likely, 13% say it was somewhat unlikely, and 27% say it was very unlikely. Motivated by the myth of widespread fraud, Republican state lawmakers initiated a push to make voting laws more restrictive. Lawsuits. After the election, the Trump campaign filed several lawsuits in multiple states, including Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. Lawyers and other observers noted the suits were unlikely to have an effect on the outcome. Loyola Law School professor Justin Levitt said, "There's literally nothing that I've seen yet with the meaningful potential to affect the final result." Some law firms have moved to drop their representation in lawsuits challenging results of the election. On December 20, Giuliani filed a petition with the U.S. Supreme Court, asking them to overturn the results of the Pennsylvania election and direct the state legislature to appoint electors. The Supreme Court was regarded as very unlikely to grant this petition, and even if they did, it would not alter the election outcome, since Biden would still have a majority of Electoral College votes without Pennsylvania. The court set the deadline for reply briefs from the respondents for January 22, 2021, 2 days after President-elect Biden's inauguration. Texas v. Pennsylvania/I. None. Trump's refusal to concede. Early in the morning on November 4, with vote counts still going on in many states, Trump claimed he had won. 4 weeks after the networks had called the election for Biden, Trump refused to acknowledge that Biden had won. Biden described Trump's refusal as an embarrassment. In the wake of the election, the General Services Administration refused to formally acknowledge Biden's victory, and the White House ordered government agencies not to cooperate with the Biden transition team in any way. Starting in 1896, when William Jennings Bryan established a precedent of formal concession by sending a congratulatory telegram to President-elect William McKinley, every losing major party presidential candidate has formally conceded. Trump acknowledged Biden's victory in a tweet on November 15, although he refused to concede and blamed his loss on fraud, stating, "He won because the election was rigged." Trump then tweeted, "I concede nothing. We have a long way to go." In a June 2021 interview with Sean Hannity, Trump stated that "we didn't win" and said that he wished President Biden success in international diplomacy, which Forbes declared as Trump as close as he's ever been to conceding his 2020 election loss. GSA delays certifying Biden as president-elect. Although all major media outlets called the election for Biden on November 7, the head of the General Services Administration, Trump appointee Emily W. Murphy, refused for over 2 weeks to certify Biden as the president-elect. Without formal GSA certification or ascertainment of the winner of the election, the official transition process was delayed. On November 23, Murphy acknowledged Biden as the winner and said the Trump administration would begin the formal transition process. Trump said he had instructed his administration to do what needs to be done but did not concede, and indicated he intended to continue his fight to overturn the election results. Suggestion to have state legislatures choose electoral college voters. Both before and after the election, Trump and other Republican leaders publicly considered asking certain Republican-controlled state legislatures to select electors for Trump rather than Biden, even in the event of a Biden victory in those states. In Pennsylvania, a state which Biden won despite its legislature being controlled by Republicans, the president's personal lawyer Rudy Giuliani asked a federal judge to consider ordering the state legislature to ignore the state's popular vote and select electors for Trump. Legal experts, including New York University law professor Richard Pildes, have said such a strategy would run into numerous legal and political problems, noting that in various battleground states, Democratic Party members elected to statewide offices would thwart such efforts, and ultimately Congress likely would not accept the votes of legislatively appointed electors over those appointed based on the election results. Law professor Lawrence Lessig noted that while the Constitution grants state legislatures the power to determine how electors are selected, including the power to directly appoint them, Article 2, Section 1, Clause 4 gives Congress the power to determine when electors must be appointed, which they have designated to be Election Day, meaning that legislatures cannot change how electors are appointed for an election after this date. In modern times, most states have used a popular vote within their state as the determining factor in who gets all the state's electors, and changing election rules after an election has been conducted could also violate the Constitution's Due Process Clause. Attempts to delay or deny election results. In November, Trump focused his efforts on trying to delay vote certifications at the county and state level. On December 2, Trump posted a 46-minute video to his social media in which he repeated his baseless claims that the election was rigged and fraudulent and called for either the state legislatures or the courts to overturn the results of the election and allow him to stay in office. He continued to apply pressure to elected Republicans in Michigan, Georgia, and Pennsylvania in an unprecedented attempt to overturn the election result. Some commentators have characterized Trump's actions as an attempted coup d'état or self-coup. On December 15, the day after the Electoral College vote, Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who was previously among those who would not recognize the election results, publicly accepted Biden's win, saying, "Today, I want to congratulate President-elect Joe Biden." Multiple news media outlets reported that at a December 18 meeting in the White House, there was discussion of Michael Flynn's suggestion to overturn the election by invoking martial law and rerunning the election in several swing states under military supervision. Army Secretary Ryan D. McCarthy and Army Chief of Staff General James McConville later issued a joint statement saying, "There is no role for the U.S. military in determining the outcome of an American election." In a December 20 tweet, Trump dismissed the accusations of wanting to declare martial law as fake news. In a December 21 news conference, outgoing Attorney General William Barr disavowed several actions reportedly being considered by Trump, including seizing voting machines, appointing a special counsel to investigate voter fraud, and appointing one to investigate Hunter Biden. On January 6, 2021, shortly after a rally held by Trump where he continued to press false claims of election fraud, a crowd of Trump supporters stormed the United States Capitol, interrupting the joint session of the United States Congress where the official Electoral College ballots were being certified. The crowd caused widespread damage to the Capitol and forced lawmakers to evacuate the chambers where debate was occurring. As part of an organized effort by Republican lawmakers to challenge the results in close states, the House and the Senate were meeting separately to debate the results of Arizona's election and accepting the Electoral College ballots submitted. Several other challenges were also planned. After the interruption, while leaders of both parties, including Vice President Pence, Speaker Pelosi, and Senate Majority Leader McConnell, all denounced the disruption and called on lawmakers to confirm the results, several Republicans pressed forward with their challenges, though they were unsuccessful in changing any of the Electoral College results, and the official vote was certified in the early morning hours of January 7. Pressure on state and local officials. As the Trump campaign's lawsuits were repeatedly rejected in court, Trump personally communicated with Republican local and state officials in at least 3 states, including state legislators, attorneys general, and governors who had supported him in the general election and continued to support him. He pressured them to overturn the election results in their states by recounting votes, throwing out certain votes, or getting the state legislature to replace the elected Democratic slate of Electoral College members with a Republican slate of electors chosen by the legislature. In late November, he personally phoned Republican members of 2 county electoral boards in Michigan, trying to get them to reverse their certification of the result in their county. He then invited members of the Michigan state legislature to the White House, where they declined his suggestion that they choose a new slate of electors. He repeatedly spoke to the Republican governor of Georgia and the Secretary of State, demanding that they reverse their state's election results, threatening them with political retaliation when they did not, strongly criticizing them in speeches and tweets, and demanding that the governor resign. During the first week of December, Trump twice phoned the Speaker of the Pennsylvania State House of Representatives, urging him to appoint a replacement slate of electors. The Speaker said he did not have that power but later joined in a letter encouraging the state's representatives in Congress to dispute the results. On January 4, The Washington Post reported that in a phone call on January 2, Trump pressured Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to overturn the state's result, telling him, "I just want to find 11,780 votes," and threatening him with legal action if he did not cooperate. On January 4, 2021, Democratic congressional leaders, believing Trump engaged in solicitation of, or conspiracy to commit, a number of election crimes, requested the FBI to investigate the incident. In addition, while some House Republicans tried to defend Trump's Georgia call, Democrats began drafting a censure resolution. 2 months later, The Washington Post acknowledged that they had originally used quotes not actually said by Trump, and added a correction to the article. Also on January 2, 2021, Trump took part in a mass phone call with nearly 300 state legislators from Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, in which he urged them to decertify the election results in their states. Recounts. On November 11, Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger ordered a statewide hand recount of the vote in addition to the normal audit process. At the time, Biden held a lead of 14,112 votes, or 0.3% in the state. The audit was concluded on November 19 and affirmed Biden's lead by 12,670 votes. The change in the count was due to a number of human errors, including memory cards that did not upload properly to the state servers, and was not attributable to any fraud in the original tally. After certifying the results, Republican Governor Brian Kemp called for another hand audit, demanding to compare signatures on absentee ballot requests to actual ballots, despite the fact that this request was impossible, as signatures on mail-in ballot applications and envelopes are checked when they are originally received by election offices, and that ballots are thereafter separated from envelopes to ensure the secrecy of the ballot. The Trump campaign requested a machine recount, which was estimated to cost taxpayers $200,000 in one Georgia county alone. This recount reaffirmed Biden's victory in the state for the third time. Trump unsuccessfully sought to overturn Biden's win in Georgia through litigation. Suits by the Trump campaign and allies were rejected by both the Georgia Supreme Court and by federal courts. Trump also sought to overturn Biden's win by pressuring Kemp to call a special session of the Georgia General Assembly so state legislators could override the Georgia election results and appoint a pro-Trump slate of electors, an entreaty rebuffed by Kemp. On November 18, the Trump campaign wired $3 million to pay for partial recounts in Milwaukee County and Dane County, Wisconsin, where Milwaukee and Madison, the two largest cities in the state and Democratic strongholds, are located. During the recount, Milwaukee County Election Commissioner Tim Posnanski said several Republican observers were breaking rules by posing as independents. The recount started November 20 and concluded on November 29, increasing Biden's lead by 87 votes. Electoral College votes. The presidential electors met in the state capital of each state and in the District of Columbia on December 14, 2020, and formalized Biden's victory, casting 306 votes for Biden/Harris and 232 votes for Trump/Pence. Unlike the 2016 election, there were no faithless electors. In 6 swing states won by Biden, groups of self-appointed Republican alternate electors met on the same day to vote for Trump. These alternate slates were not signed by the governors of the states they claim to represent, did not have the backing of any state legislature, and have no legal status. Even after the casting of the electoral votes and rejection of his lawsuits seeking to overturn the election by at least 86 judges, Trump refused to concede defeat. In a speech following the Electoral College vote, Biden praised the resiliency of U.S. democratic institutions and the high election turnout and called for national unity. Biden also condemned Trump, and those who backed his efforts to subvert the election outcome, for adopting a stance so extreme that we've never seen it before, a position that refused to respect the will of the people, refused to respect the rule of law and refused to honor our Constitution, and for exposing state election workers and officials to political pressure, verbal abuse, and even threats of physical violence that was simply unconscionable. Certification of Electoral College votes. The 117th United States Congress first convened on January 3, 2021, and was scheduled to count and certify the Electoral College votes on January 6, 2021. There were 222 Democrats and 212 Republicans in the House. There were 51 Republicans, 46 Democrats, and 2 independents in the Senate. Several Republican members of the House and Senate said they would raise objections to the reported count in several states, meeting the requirement that if a member from each body objects, the 2 houses must meet separately to discuss whether to accept the certified state vote. A statement from the Vice President's office said Pence welcomes the plan by Republicans to raise objections and bring forward evidence challenging the election results. On December 28, 2020, Representative Louis Gohmert filed a lawsuit in Texas challenging the constitutionality of the Electoral Count Act of 1887, claiming Vice President Pence has the power and ability to unilaterally decide which slates of electoral votes get counted. The case was dismissed on January 1, 2021, for lack of both standing and jurisdiction. The plaintiffs filed an appeal, and the appeal was dismissed by a 3-judge panel of the appeals court the next day. As vice president, Pence was due to preside over the January 6, 2021, congressional session to count the electoral votes, which is normally a non-controversial, ceremonial event. In January 2021, Trump began to pressure Pence to take action to overturn the election, demanding both in public and in private that Pence use his position to overturn the election results in swing states and declare Trump and Pence the winners of the election. Pence demurred that the law does not give him that power. Starting in December, Trump called for his supporters to stage a massive protest in Washington, D.C. on January 6 to argue against certification of the electoral vote, using tweets such as "Big protest in D.C. on January 6, be there, will be wild." D.C. police were concerned, and the National Guard was alerted because several rallies in December had turned violent. On January 6, Trump supporters stormed the Capitol, stopping the count of the votes and prompting an evacuation of press and lawmakers. The group entered the House and Senate chambers and vandalized offices. 5 people died as a result of the events in the Capitol. 1 person was shot by police. 1 Capitol police officer died from a stroke after physically engaging with rioters. 1 person died of a heart attack, another of a stroke, and the final person's death is still under investigation. Trump has been accused of inciting the violence with his rhetoric, an accusation that was reinforced with an article of impeachment filed on January 13 for incitement of insurrection. Congress reconvened that same night, after the Capitol was cleared of trespassers. The Senate resumed its session at around 8 p.m. on January 6 to finish debating the objection to the Arizona electors. Objections to the Pennsylvania electors were also considered. The joint session completed its work shortly before 4 a.m. on Thursday, January 7, declaring Biden and Harris the winners. Several commentators viewed the attack on the Capitol building as an indicator of increased political destabilization in the country that could lead to a spike of political violence in future elections, ranging from domestic terrorism to a second American Civil War. Post-certification. On January 11, 2021, Representative Cori Bush filed a resolution calling for the possible expulsion of more than 100 Republican members of the U.S. House of Representatives who voted against certifying results of the presidential election, and Senator Sheldon Whitehouse said the Senate Ethics Committee must consider the expulsion, or censure, and punishment, of Senators Cruz, Hawley, and perhaps others. On March 31, 2021, the Republican caucus of the Arizona State Senate hired several outside firms to examine the results of the presidential and senatorial elections in Maricopa County, where Biden had won by a large margin. There had been 3 previous audits and recounts of that county's results. The examination was initially funded by $150,000 from the state Senate operating budget. Additional funding was to come from outside sources. In July, the lead firm conducting the review released a summary of major donors, indicating $5.7 million was raised from 5 groups associated with individuals who had cast doubt on the presidential election. The audit began on April 22, 2021, and was expected to last 60 days. The investigation was still ongoing in August when a judge issued an order for the release of documents. On September 24, a preliminary release of the audit claimed to have found minor discrepancies in the original, state-certified count, which had actually widened Biden's margin by 360 votes. On May 10, 2021, over 120 retired U.S. generals and admirals published an open letter alleging that there had been election irregularities, suggesting that the election had not been fair and honest and did not accurately reflect the will of the people, and arguing for tighter restrictions on voting. On May 12, 2021, U.S. Representative Liz Cheney was removed from her party leadership role as chair of the House Republican Conference, partially for continuing to assert that the election had been fair and that the election results were final. Well into Biden's presidency, Trump continues to insist that he had actually won the 2020 election. As of August 2021, surveys found that a majority of Republicans believe it. A widespread rumor predicted that Trump would be somehow reinstated to the presidency in August 2021, although the predicted date of August 13 passed without incident. Viewership. See also: protests against Donald Trump, social media in the 2020 United States presidential election, 2020 United States gubernatorial elections, 2024 United States presidential election. Notes. References.